In this lecture segment, we are talking about Constantine, his patronage of Christian art, and how Christian art changes as it becomes associated with the Roman Empire. We'll be discussing basilica and central plan structures and a couple of mosaics. We are talking about Constantine's formative role in making Christianity the dominant cultural force in Western Europe. Remember that Christianity had been practiced on the down low for about 300 years, with occasional incidents of persecution. Constantine converted to Christianity in 337 CE, the year of his death. As the closer one was to death when baptized, the better chance someone had of not sinning before death. He was not just a deathbed ally of Christianity, but spent a few decades supporting its establishment as a legitimate, popular, public religion with the power of the Roman Empire behind it. In 313, he issued the Edict of Milan in conjunction with the Roman Empire for the Eastern Empire, which legalized all religions in the empire, such that Christianity was no longer illegal. In 324, he became the emperor over a united Roman Empire, and in 325 was in charge of a meeting to codify Christian doctrine. Constantine is still the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of the Roman religion, and he also offers tribute to Mithras every year. But even though he is still involved in the Roman religion and Mithraism, he begins commissioning or paying to create Christian structures of worship, our first structures designed and built specifically to be Christian houses of worship. He moves the capital of the empire to Constantinople, previously called Byzantium, but continues supporting Christianity in Rome through architectural commissions. And one of those is Old St. Peter's, which was on the site of the current St. Peter's in the Vatican in Rome, as you can see in this aerial view today. And then in this layered plan, you can see in brown the original plan for the basilica structure Constantine commissioned. It is located at the traditional site where Peter was buried after he was martyred or killed for his faith. He was buried outside of the city walls of Rome. His bones, the relics of St. Peter, are buried in the catacomb underneath the altar. A relic is an object associated with a holy person or saint. They can be objects or body parts. Sacred relics give churches significance, and the design of churches revolves around how to protect relics and to use them as the focal point of worship. Constantine commissions a grand church for this sacred site. Designers working on the project have the heritage of Roman construction to choose from as they design and build, with precedents from Roman temples and the Pantheon, the centrally planned dome structure, a rotunda, as well as the basilica plan, and they choose to build a basilica. A basilica structure was a familiar type of Roman building. It was easy and relatively cheap to build, flexible in plan and materials, and adaptable to whichever materials were available in different locales where churches might be built. It created a long central hall that could hold lots of people. Remember that at the Parthenon, at the Ziggurat, and the Great Temple to Amun, we did not need large interior spaces where many people could gather and worship, because that was not how worship worked at that time. But for Christians, gathering together to partake of the Eucharist is the key component of worship. So the space had to be able to hold lots of people, and very importantly, it was secular. Basilicas were courts of law or government spaces, not temples. Basilicas were also imperial audience halls, so they had a resonance of authority, kind of a seal of imperial approval that Christians desired at that time. Christians at this moment stay far away from the resonance of paganism that was part of Roman temple design. Instead, they pick the secular structure that was familiar and flexible and adapt it and give it new meaning as a Christian structure. So how did they adapt the basilica design, and what type of space did they make? Like the Basilica Olpia, the structure is organized around an axis, a line that runs from the front to the rear. Let's start at the entrance with the gatehouse, and then an atrium, a place for cleansing, a narthex, which is as far as unbaptized folks could go, and then a main central space called a nave with aisles on either side. Columns and an entablature run down the nave, with wooden trusses above supporting the roof. The columns were harvested from Roman structures, so we have another example of spolia, the recycling of materials from an old building to a new building. The aisles have a lower roof than the nave ceiling, making room for clear-story windows above to let light into the building. A crossbar called a transept provides more space for worshippers to be close to St. Peter whose remains are below the altar here at the apse end of the church. We end up with a space suited for large public gatherings Christian worship demanded. The cruciform shape of this building, looking like a cross, will eventually become the Latin cross shape of many of the other churches we will look at this semester. And in this reconstruction of the interior, we see the main space, the nave, the side aisles, and the clear-story windows. The main focus of the building and of the axis is on the altar, the blue box at the back of the image, and the altar is above where the relics of St. Peter are entombed below. The longitudinal axis of the basilica takes us to the apse, another form of a sacred niche like what we saw at Dura Europos. The Basilica Ulpia's apse held the courts of law. At the Basilica of Maxentius and Constantine, it held the colossal sculpture of Constantine. Here it focuses on the relics of St. Peter and Christ's triumph over death. Worshippers come to attend Mass and receive the Eucharist, communion, or the Lord's Supper, which is when priests reenact the sacrifice of Christ, and worshippers come and consume wine and bread that, according to the doctrine of transubstantiation, literally becomes the flesh and blood of Christ. A priest would be at the front at the altar as the focus of worship. The form of a triumphal arch frames the approach to the altar and apse end, but this time it does not celebrate an emperor's accomplishments. It shows Christ's victory over death. The Roman triumphal arch is transformed from the emperor's triumph to Christ's triumph. The design of the structure draws on Roman visual vocabulary, but uses it for Christian means, that syncretism at play again that we talked about with Good Shepherd imagery. A familiar form, the triumphal arch, serves a newly legalized religion. Although we can't step into Old St. Peter's anymore, we can visit Santa Sabina, another early Christian church in Rome, built about 100 years after Old St. Peter's and on a much smaller scale. On the plain brick exterior, you see the apse, the sacred niche, and on the interior you can get a feel for the axial focus of the structure, propelling the visitor to the apse end, the focus of worship during the Mass. You can get a sense of the light and how being in a space like this might have felt. Although Old St. Peter's was much grander and bigger than Santa Sabina, being in this 1600-year-old church space gives us a glimpse of the type of experience these early basilica structures created for a visitor. We do have another adaptation of a Roman building type during the age of Constantine, and that is using centrally planned dome structures like what we saw at the Pantheon for tombs, but later on they will also be used for baptistries and martyria, or shrines to honor martyrs. If we look at Old St. Peter's once more, we see two centrally planned structures, like an appendage off the transept. These were both rotundas. Recent scholarship suggests they were already here when Constantine commissioned Old St. Peter's, and that they were used as foundations for the new rotunda structures you see in the plan. Both were probably mausoleums, or buildings to hold tombs, for emperors or members of the imperial family. One surviving example of a central plan is the mausoleum for one of Constantine's daughters, later transformed into a church and called Santa Costanza after one of the daughters potentially buried here. It was originally hooked to a basilica church, like what we just saw with the mausolea at Old St. Peter's. The structure uses a central plan, meaning that the design radiates out from a central point, similar to what we saw at the Pantheon, and includes a dome that pulls the visitor skyward on a vertical axis, instead of pulling the viewer down a long horizontal axis to an apse like we have at a basilica structure. A central plan has some similar parts to a basilica plan, just oriented differently. We have a narthex and then enter the rotunda, the central domed space. The tomb of the deceased was likely placed in a niche on an access from the narthex through the dome. The rotunda is surrounded by a barrel-vaulted ambulatory, which is a path like an aisle that curves around the building. The elevated dome includes clear-story windows that bring light into the structure. The sarcophagus for Constantine's daughter was placed opposite the entrance on the other side of the dome. Made of porphyry, the same stone that we saw used for the tetrarchs, it spoke of imperial power. Here are a couple of views of the interior of the structure. The altar was added later when it was converted from being an imperial mausoleum to being a church. The decoration of the structure brings our discussion of Christian art during the late antique period full circle, as we have mosaics showing a vineyard and the harvesting of grapes. If one was a Christian, he or she might understand these in the context of the Eucharist and the preparation of wine for Holy Communion, or in the context of Christ being called the Lord of the Vineyard. But scenes of vineyards and grapes could also relate to the god Dionysus, the god of wine, and would be read as such by pagans at this time. Yet another example of a syncretic work of art that could be read differently depending on the viewer's context. Under the patronage of Constantine and the Imperial family, we have the establishment of two influential church plans, the Basilica Plan and the Central Plan. The Basilica Plan will be picked up as the most common church plan in the western half of the empire, Western Europe, while the Central Plan will be picked up as the most common church plan in the eastern half of the empire, the Byzantine Empire. Let's look at one last site to conclude our discussion. During this turbulent period when the Roman Empire is struggling to stay together because of internal power struggles and gradual incursions from groups like the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths, the capital of the Roman portion of the empire is moved from Rome to Ravenna. Geographically, Ravenna, it was easy to defend, easy to supply, and had a significant history as a base of military operations for the empire. We end up with a slew of building projects constructed during a relatively short period of time, and one of them is a centrally planned structure, potentially a mausoleum, that was once hooked onto a church. It is called the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia, a powerful daughter and sister of emperors. It was probably not her mausoleum, but we do think she was the patron of this structure, meaning that she paid to have it built. It uses recycled Roman bricks on the exterior, as was typical for structures during this period. Inside, though, it is richly decorated with both marble veneer and mosaics, which cover a dome and lunettes at the end of short barrel vaults, giving us a glimpse of the finery and richness of these early Christian structures. We've talked about mosaic before, but this takes mosaic to a new level. You can see the individual tesserae or squares of tile carefully placed like pixels to produce lavish, bright patterns, giving us a glimpse of the richness of imperial Christian commissions. Here you can see the short barrel vault approaching the door to the outside, and the mosaic we are focusing on right here. We see an iconography we recognize, Christ as the Good Shepherd. He is surrounded by sheep, seated in a landscape. It looks pretty Roman in style. The figure has bulk and occupies space pretty convincingly, such as having the knees project forward and space towards us. But we don't see a high degree of naturalism. The scene is stylized and simplified, which was typical for art at this time and place. Each plant has its own space, and the sheep's coats are pretty patterned. But when we compare this mosaic to the depiction of Christ from the catacomb, we see some really important differences. The catacomb painting uses a humble, inexpensive medium, just paint on plaster. But here we have mosaic, a rich, expensive medium. We have the same iconography, but instead of being a humble caretaker of the flock, this is royal Christ wearing purple. By law, only imperial leaders were allowed to wear purple, so this is Christ connected to the power of the empire. This is the last late antique work we are covering, and it is made after 380 CE, when Christianity is made the official state religion of the Roman Empire, and anyone who is not a Christian was called a heretic. All of the pagan temples are closed or transformed, and Christianity becomes the church for all of the Roman Empire. We see in the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia that by the end of the late antique period, Christianity is fully associated with the power of empire, setting us up for the dominance of Christianity in the medieval period.